Playing PC titles on the go used to be a dream, and at one point all we really had was getting a gaming laptop and gaming for maybe an hour or so before the battery died, or just plugging into a wall and staying connected to the wall throughout your entire gaming session. Now there are viable options, mature options that are readily available for anyone that's interested in them. You have things like the Steam Deck, you have the ROG Ally from Asus, as well as the Legion Go from Lenovo, and recently released, you also have the MSI Claw. Now, I won't be talking about the MSI Claw in this video, but I will be talking about the Steam Deck as well as the ROG Ally and Legion Go and comparing all three of these because they've been out on the market long enough to mature and become a very stable and viable option for those that are interested in them. The goal with this video is to show you the ins and outs of all of these handhelds and provide enough information so that you can make a decision for yourself, because at the end of the day, it really depends on what games you're going to be into or what it is specifically that you're going to be using these handhelds for. Oh, and by the way, this video is sponsored by Satisfy and their Stealth Grip for the Steam Deck and Steam Deck OLED. More on them later on in this video. So let's talk about one of the biggest differentiating factors between anything that you're buying, and that's pricing. When it comes down to pricing with Valve's Steam Deck, there are a couple of options that are available for you. For example, they have the LCD model, which is the original model of the Steam Deck that's still up for sale. They've been phasing out the 64GB and the 512GB model, but they still have the 256GB model available for sale at $399. Now, in comparison to the OLED, you aren't going to be getting that 90 Hz refresh rate that you would get on the OLED. You also will be getting a slower Wi-Fi chipset. It's Wi-Fi 5 instead of 6E. Also, the battery is a little bit smaller, and overall, the experience just isn't as good as the OLED in my opinion. But if you want something that's relatively inexpensive that you can take with you on the go, is comparable to the Nintendo Switch and is, well, more powerful in many ways than the Nintendo Switch, but still has that mobile factor, then this might be an option for you. Also, I want to go ahead and state that even though it's 256GB of storage, you can easily add storage with an SD card or by swapping out the internal SSD that's inside. Now, when you go one step up, you go to the $549 512GB OLED model. Now, with this specific model, you aren't going to get that anti-glare etched screen that you would get with the 1TB or the limited edition version of the Steam Deck, but you still get that 90 Hz refresh rate, 6nm APU, you get faster Wi-Fi with Wi-Fi 6E, and you are going to get a bigger battery, which means that you're going to be able to play longer. I personally, if you're interested in this, this is the version that I recommend. Obviously, if you don't want to deal with switching out the internal components and getting a larger SSD and you don't want to deal with any of that, you can pay $649 for the 1TB OLED model. You're going to get a lot of the same things that you would get with that $549 version, but you are going to get that anti-glare etched screen. So this is something that is obviously up to personal preference. For me, I like the etched screen, and there is a little bit of a conversation in the community in terms of whether or not this affects the deep OLED blacks that you would get on this in comparison to not having that anti-glare etch screen. Personally, for me, I typically play in an environment like this where it's relatively dark, so I don't have to worry about it, and it doesn't really affect me at all. Even when I was traveling for work recently, I didn't really see too much of a difference in the grand scheme of things, but it is a personal preference when it comes down to it. When it comes to the ROG Ally, you have a couple of options, literally only a couple. Asus released a Z1 Extreme version of the ROG Ally and a regular Z1 version. I personally can't recommend the Z1 at all. Originally when it was released, it was $699 for the Z1 Extreme, and then it was $599 for the regular Z1. At the time of this recording, Asus has the Z1 Extreme on sale at Best Buy for $599 instead of $699, so you save $100. And then the regular Z1 is $399 instead of $599, so you save $200 there. Now, even with that price difference that's there, I would still recommend the Z1 Extreme just because you are going to be getting much more power for the price. I mean, it's just the teraflops in terms of power is just huge. Now, I've already talked about my experience with the ROG Ally in contrast to the Steam Deck, and I'll click that. If you click this, it'll go ahead and it'll guide you to that video. But at the end of the day, you have two options, and really the only difference is just the processing power that's there. Like when you have that Z1 Extreme, it just makes a huge difference in contrast to the Z1. With the Legion Go, similar to the Asus ROG Ally, you only have two options. The only difference is that the options difference really is the power, but more the storage. So you have $699 for the 512 gigabyte version of the Legion Go, and then you have $749.99 for the 1 terabyte version of the Legion Go. To be honest with you, 50 bucks more for just doubling the amount of storage that's there is honestly, in my opinion, like it's worth it, but it's up to you in terms of what it is that you want to go ahead and buy and go for. And these are readily available from Best Buy at that price point. So again, it really depends on what it is that you want to go ahead and go for and whether or not you want that extra storage or not. Let's do a quick tour of the Steam Deck OLED. When it comes down to it, they're all more or less the same when it comes to the actual form factor itself. Now you are going to have your D-pad as well as your analog sticks, your start and select buttons, and these trackpads. The haptics on these trackpads and overall the handheld itself are really improved in contrast to the LCD model. The OLED model is good too, but it's just like, I don't know, it's night and day when it comes down to it. You'll really feel the difference when you actually compare the two side by side. But if you're just picking one over the other, you probably won't even be able to tell. Now, when it comes to the Steam and quick access menu here, the QAM menu, I feel like, I don't know, I wish that it was more pronounced, but that's just me. Whenever I'm like in the middle of playing something and I'm deep into it, I want to go ahead and be able to, you know, feel this when it comes down to it, but it's just a personal issue. Now, when it comes to the face buttons, they feel great. There's enough travel distance to feel satisfied, and you really have everything just kind of like falling in line with the actual ergonomics of this handheld. The triggers, they feel great. The actual the RB and LB are much more improved because you can actually click anywhere on here and it'll just press down without any issues. On the backside, you have your R4 and R5 as well as your L4 and L5. Now, I've used this a couple of times and they feel great overall when they're programmed correctly, but it really is a personal preference. Same thing goes with the trackpads. It's a personal preference when it comes to that. On the top side, you are going to have your power button as well as a USB-C, 3.5 millimeter jack, and your volume rocker right here, your plus and your minus for your volume, as well as the exhaust fan. There's your intake on this side, and on the bottom, on this little tiny thing that's right here, that's where your micro SD card is going to go. So let's talk about the ROG Ally. When it comes down to it, this feels so much smaller in contrast to the Steam Deck. I mean, there's a huge difference in terms of like sizing, but the grips is really the thing that kind of like threw me off. I mean, when I first picked this up, I was like, oh my God, like I don't even know where to like put my fingers, because over here, like I know that it's like right there and I can feel pretty comfortable on that. But here it was just kind of like, I don't know if I'm doing this the right way. So my fingers ended up kind of just like going in and just having a little bit less grip and comfort on the grand scheme of things. But one of the biggest differentiating factors in contrast to the Steam Deck is that there are no trackpads. Now, me personally, I don't see this as a big deal, but I do know that some people, they want these trackpads to be there in order to play their RTS games, or if they just want a little bit more precision in contrast to having analog sticks. Now, you do have a D-pad that's okay, it's not bad, and then you have your quick access as well as your armory crate button, and then your start and select button. The face buttons are very reminiscent of the Xbox Series controller, and on the top side you are going to have your LB and your RB button as well as your trigger buttons. Now, for me, my LB button has been kind of getting stuck from time to time, and it kind of just takes like a rough push before I actually start gaming on this. You are going to have your 3.5 millimeter jack as well as your micro SD card, the fabled micro SD card that has overheating issues. Then there is your USB-C port as well as your volume rocker that's in the middle. I've never really been a fan of that. And then you have your power button, which also acts as a fingerprint scanner. The only reason I don't really like that volume rocker being there is because you kind of have to like reach all the way around in order to do that. Now, there is an option in the quick access menu. If you push this, it'll go ahead and it'll pop up on the left hand side, and you can just increase and decrease the volume from there. You do have your fan exhausts over here, and on the back side you are going to have these two little triggers that are right here that are programmable. You can go ahead and do whatever it is that you want with them. I do love these speakers that are here, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later on in the video. And on the bottom you have absolutely nothing. And here is the big kahuna. This is the Legion Go, and this is such a huge handheld that it's actually almost hard to believe that it actually is a handheld. But here we are. Now on the front end of this handheld, you're going to get 2 analog sticks. The D-pad has a very little travel distance, like to the point to where it's kind of like this has nothing. Down here is where you actually have your start and select buttons, which is, you know, interesting, but I understand why they did that. Over here you have your actual Legion Go software or command center to go into, and that goes out and opens up the software. And here you have your quick access menu where you can go ahead and toggle different settings very quickly. This is probably one of the biggest things that I love about the Legion Go, and it's an actual trackpad. So whenever you're doing anything in Windows, it's nice to have that trackpad to kind of go ahead and move things around and actually do things natively, just like Windows is used to, not like a touchscreen or anything like that, or using an analog stick to kind of move around and then using things to trigger it. It's just boom, and then if you want to tap, it'll go ahead and it'll select whatever is there. On the top side, you are going to have your 2 buttons as well as your triggers. Here are your volume up and down buttons, as well as your USB-C port and a micro SD card slot. Here's your exhaust vent, and then a 3.5mm jack. And this is probably one of the worst places to put a power button, but I'll talk about that later on in the video. Here you have upward firing speakers, which again, I'll talk about why I don't really like them later on in the video. And then on the back side, you are going to have your actual Legion Go kickstand, which boom, you can go ahead and set up, which is pretty awesome. And then you have your programmable buttons that are here. There's a reason why these are actually up here and these are on this side. It is pretty weird, but there's a reason why. And we'll go ahead and actually talk about that right now. So these things that are right here, these little buttons, when you actually do that, unlike the Nintendo Switch where you pull up, you actually pull down, and you can pull this out to go ahead and control your games. So this is also, this one right here is actually the mouse itself. On the bottom, there's a little switch, and you can go from off to FPS mode, and it'll go ahead and it'll turn it on. With your Legion Go, you're also going to have this little vertical mouse stand where you can go ahead and set up your mouse, and then from there you can go ahead and game and just have this. Whenever you're in this mode, this becomes your WASD key, and then boom, you have everything going like it's nobody's business. Obviously, this is geared towards FPS games. I'm not going to be winning any sort of competitions or tournaments while playing on my Legion Go, but it is a nice option. It is a nice option. You can turn this into a work computer that you can also game with you on the go. So it really depends on your personal use case scenario, but there are definitely some options with this. So let's talk about the Steam Deck and its overall build quality. I love the fact that this thing is just one solid piece of hardware. That way you don't have to worry about switching things in and out, or things accidentally breaking, or any sort of peripherals or whatever it may be. It just works. I love that it's well built, because if I were to give this to my son, which he does have the LCD version that I have, I don't have to worry about it, you know, falling and all of a sudden breaking. Now, that being said, this still is a handheld PC, so there is some risk when it comes to giving this to a child, but at the same time, if you were to get a protective case or whatever it may be, you have less to worry about in the grand scheme of things. Still though, I love the fact that Valve teamed up with iFixit in order to provide a lot of repairability options. So if something were to break, or if you wanted to swap a piece out for something else, it's readily available with plenty of instructions, and all you have to do is just buy it. It ships to wherever you are in the world, and boom, you don't have to worry about anything. Now, obviously, you'd want to prevent your Steam Deck from getting any sort of unwanted damage, and in order to do so, I would recommend a case or a cover of some kind, and that's where today's sponsor, Satisfy, comes into play with their Stealth Grip for the Steam Deck. This comes with a Stealth Grip as well as a cover, so you have a strong ergonomic grip on the Steam Deck, as well as plenty of space for things to just work naturally, including the charging cable that comes with the Steam Deck dock. On top of that, it comes with rise pads, so it comes with a notch and notch extension for your thumbsticks, as well as silicone risers for the back buttons to just fit nice and snug and comfortable. And you also get Stealth Glass Pro, which is a screen protector for the screen on the Steam Deck. Follow the link in the description below to learn more about the Stealth Grip and protect your Steam Deck today. And thanks to Satisfy for sponsoring this video. When it comes to the ROG Ally, though, you can definitely tell that there's a clear design flaw in the overall layout of this SD card slot. Now, there are other issues that have arisen since I've actually gotten this. For instance, the dead zones being as big as they are. Technically, it was fleshed out with an OS fix, but in the grand scheme of things, I still have issues on my unit. Now, there are people that have commented in my previous video talking about the ROG Ally that have said, hey, this has already been fixed. You don't have to worry about these things. But at the end of the the day, it's still something to take into account and something that can affect literally anyone. I still have that issue with the left bumper where sometimes things just don't work, but it is what it is. Overall, aside from those minute flaws, this is still a great piece of tech. I mean, it feels heavy. It feels like it can take a beating, and changing out any parts in the back are still relatively easy to do. And if you follow a YouTube tutorial or anything like that, you should be able to fix anything that you want. Now, I do want to go ahead and say that they do not have a partnership. Asus does not have a partnership with iFixit when it comes to actually changing things out. So in order to actually get spare parts, you have to go through Asus's third-party option, which is Accessories. I'll have a link in the description below if you want to go ahead and buy anything from them. But at the end of the day, I prefer to have something like iFixit, where it's just, that's what they do. They offer repairability options to fix any piece of tech that you have, instead of buying something from, I don't know, I don't feel as comfortable buying from a site like accessories.com. It doesn't feel as secure, even though I know it's Asus, but still, it leaves a lot to be desired in the grand scheme of things. When it comes to the Legion Go, man, like it's huge. It's so freaking huge that it's heavy, and I don't know, but the detachable Joy-Cons, or whatever you want to go ahead and call them, because they're there, it just, I don't know, I feel like this is prone to just having issues. Like any sort of dust or anything might get into the actual connectors that are there, or the connections themselves, they might degrade over time. And I know that Lenovo, on their website, they sell replaceable parts that you can go ahead and buy, and they'll ship them to wherever you are in the world. But I still feel like, I don't know, this is probably the most fragile out of all of them, at least in my opinion. When it comes down to it, I know that I look at it and I'm just like, like this could break at any moment, but it is what it is. That being said, I can understand how something like this could degrade over a long period of time, but because of how well built it is, it might not. I mean, I haven't experienced any issues on my end whenever I use my Legion Go, but this is something to take into account, because I've had a Nintendo Switch. If you're watching this, you might have had a Nintendo Switch, and you have noticed how those Joy-Cons have degraded over a long period of time, and those connectors that are there to connect Joy-Cons to the actual Nintendo Switch just fall apart over a long period of time. I would expect a similar situation when using the Legion Go on the go. Now, when it comes to comparing the screens on all three of these handhelds, it really comes down to personal preference. When I first got my Steam Deck, the original LCD model, I was a little bit underwhelmed by the color that was represented on that panel itself. Just for a little bit of context, for my day job, I edit photo and video for my boss. So all of these screens that are in front of me, they're all color calibrated, and they're color calibrated to T, and I constantly keep them up to date. So whenever I look at a panel that doesn't really, I don't know, have 100% color representation or accurate color representation, it just leaves a lot to be desired, at least for me. So I get turned off a little bit when it comes to that stuff. With that original Steam Deck LCD model, it just didn't hit any of like the quotas. I think it had around 73%, correct me in the comments if I'm wrong, but 73% color gamut representation. With the Steam Deck OLED refresh though, that is boosted all the way up to P3 110% color gamut. It's awesome because it just means that you're going to get more color representation, and it's going to be accurate color representation on top of that. Now, it does support HDR, and when it gets up to HDR, it does support 1000 nits peak brightness. Non-HDR or SDR, you're going to get 600 nits. Also, I want to go ahead and say that all of this is with a 90 hertz refresh rate, and you are going to be getting less than 0.1% millisecond response time. Honestly, it's awesome when it comes down to having something like this on the go. Also, it's worth mentioning that this is a 16:10 aspect ratio. There are some games that don't support 16:10 and they'll default to 16:9, but because of the OLED nature that's there, you're not even going to be able to tell, because those pixels that are turned off are just going to blend in with the bezel around the screen anyways. When the Asus ROG Ally was first announced, I was extremely excited because it took essentially everything that was happening with the Steam Deck LCD model that I didn't like and improved upon it. The screen itself was enough for me to get hyped because it's 100% sRGB color gamut, which means that all the colors that are there are accurately represented, and it is so much more, I don't know, it just has so much more oomph in comparison to the Steam Deck LCD model. On top of that, you're talking about double the refresh rate. So instead of 60 hertz, it's 120 hertz. And because it's a 16:9 aspect ratio, it's compatible with everything. You don't have to worry about having bezels on the top and the bottom. Things just work. If you want to scale down from 1080 to 720, you can do it without having to worry about anything. And the screen is so bright at 500 nits that you can game without having to worry about missing out on specific details whenever you're playing in handheld mode on the go. One of the biggest things with the Legion Go, literally and both figuratively, is the screen itself. At 8.8 inches, I mean, there's just so much space. I mean, guys, it's humongous. It's literally huge, guys, especially in comparison to like everything else. Obviously, it's 144 hertz, so you're going to get smooth gameplay no matter what. But I will say that because of the processing power in this handheld, I don't think that there are going to be too many AAA titles that hit that 144 hertz refresh rate. If you're playing 2D titles like, I don't know, like Celeste or Hollow Knight, then yeah, you might go ahead and hit that 144 hertz refresh rate on that. I also want to go ahead and mention that this is a 16:10 aspect ratio, so you're going to run into the same problems that I ran into with the Steam Deck. You're going to get bars on the top and the bottom of the screen if the game doesn't natively support that aspect ratio. Because of that LCD screen, you are going to be able to hit 500 nits peak brightness whenever you're playing out and about. The couple of times that I've taken the Legion Go with me on travel for work or whatever it may be, it's definitely left a lot to be desired. The screen is beautiful, it's immaculate, but because it's so big and there's so many pixels on screen, I fear that that might affect the battery life in the long run. So each of these handhelds have been put to 50% brightness so that you can kind of see and contrast between all of them. And for the most part, they each do a pretty good job of representing the colors that are there. Obviously at 50% brightness, there is a little bit of a difference, especially when you have an LCD screen versus an OLED screen. I'm not going to go too deep into how LCD and OLED work, but long story short, the entire screen, there's a panel behind it that goes ahead and lights up all of the pixels that are there, whereas an OLED panel, it only lights up the pixels that are actually being used. So if it's black, it's not going to go ahead and actually light up, if at all. So whenever you're looking at all of these, I tend to go ahead and look for colors that go ahead and pop out in terms of or in contrast to anything else that's out there. And this is pretty common one that's right here, so you can go ahead and see the difference between all of them. Now I do see that there's a little bit of a reflection from my light, but all in all, everything seems to be almost on par. I would say that the ROG Ally has a little tiny bit more saturation on the pinks in contrast to the Legion Go and the Steam Deck OLED, but overall the colors are almost on a point. I love how well all of these panels look, especially in contrast to the original Steam Deck. Speaking of battery life, let's go ahead and get into what battery life looks like on all of these handhelds. The only caveat is that I am going to be talking about the Steam Deck LCD model as well as the Steam Deck OLED model. So you have two different options when it comes to that. But with the Asus ROG Ally, everything's the same. Same thing goes with the Legion Go. Everything's the same no matter which model you pick up. With the Steam Deck LCD model, you're looking at anywhere between 1 to maybe 2 hours. I know that they market it that you can get up to 3 hours. And in some instances, if you're playing light 2D titles, maybe you might be able to get that 3-hour mark. But all in all, I saw more realistically a 1 to 1.5 hour depending on the games that you play. The same thing can be said for the Steam Deck OLED. Depending on the games that you play will affect the battery life that you have. I've experienced anywhere between 2.5 to 3 hours all the way up to 5 and 6 hours depending on the games that you're playing. Currently I'm playing the original Final Fantasy VII and I'm seeing anywhere between 5 to 5.5 hours on average with a full charge. Of course, if I'm playing a more recent title on the Steam Deck, it's not going to last quite as long and you're looking at more into that 2-ish hour mark. With the ROG Ally, you would expect anywhere between 1 to maybe 2, depending on the games that you're playing. Obviously, the real world experience that I have with the ROG Ally is playing more AAA titles like Baldur's Gate, for instance, which I love Baldur's Gate 3. If you haven't played it, I highly recommend it. But when it comes down to it, I was getting anywhere between 1 to an hour and 15 minutes playing Baldur's Gate 3. But if I was playing something like, let's say, I don't know, like Hollow Knight, for instance, that's when you're going to get closer to like that 2-hour mark on it. But because it's a Windows handheld and there's so many things that are happening in the background, I would assume that that attributes towards the overall battery life of the handheld itself. With the Legion Go, though, I hate to say it, but it's probably one of the worst ones out of all of them. It's just that I want it to be amazing, but because of how big it is, how many pixels are being pushed out, all the horsepower that's processing inside of it, I feel like it's not good. I have a hard time hitting around an hour in terms of gameplay on this handheld itself. Sometimes I might hit an hour and a half if I'm playing titles that aren't that heavy, but because again, that screen, how big it is, how many pixels are being pushed out, and the types of games that you play, you might see maybe an hour, maybe an hour and a half if you're lucky. But unfortunately, the Legion Go, when comparing all three of these, has the worst battery life. When it comes to audio, the Steam Deck is pretty straightforward. You have two front-facing speakers that are stereo, and they do a really good job in terms of making sure that you can hear everything that's happening. Personally, I've said this before in the past, I prefer to have headphones on whenever I'm actually playing any games on any handheld. I just like to have a more immersive experience. But with the Steam Deck, it's pretty straightforward. You can connect either via Bluetooth or 3.5mm jack if you want to go ahead and use headphones, but the speakers themselves are more than adequate. Audio on the Asus ROG Ally is just a little tiny bit better than the Steam Deck. Now, yes, you are still going to have two front-facing speakers, and you're able to go ahead and get audio from that, but there's a little tiny bit of extra magic from Dolby in this handheld because you have spatial audio from them. And the first time that I tried that was shortly after the Asus ROG Ally was released. I tried it, it's set on by default, and when I was playing games, I noticed that there was like a little bit of a crackle that was there, and I just thought that maybe the volume was too high or whatever it may be, but turns out that that was just because of the Dolby spatial audio that was there. After a couple of driver updates and getting things squashed out, it finally works just fine, and it's so cool having this immersive, almost surround sound effect whenever you're playing a game without wearing headphones and just having that on the go without any sort of extra hardware. Now, you can obviously turn that off and have two front-facing speakers that have stereo audio coming your way, but having that spatial audio from Dolby just adds a nice little extra layer. It's a nice luxury when it comes to playing games and being immersed in them. And when it comes to audio on the Legion Go, it's just not good, guys. Like, there's no ifs, ands, or buts. I don't know how else to go around it, but the upward firing speakers that are on the Legion Go, they're very tinny, they're small, and because they're upward firing, most of the audio just goes up, and none of it comes to your actual ears. So it's not really a pleasant or immersive experience. And I understand why those speakers are there because of the layout of the handheld. I just wish that they kind of took the approach that Nintendo did with their whole Joy-Con and Switch-like experience with having the speakers on the bottom. It just, I don't know, it kind of kills the whole immersive vibe if you're constantly having to like go to 100% in terms of like the volume, and you're still not going to be able to hear everything that's happening on the game itself. When it comes to playing games on the Steam Deck itself, the performance is really similar whether you go with the LCD or the OLED model. Despite the difference in the APU as well as battery size and so on and so forth, all of that stuff doesn't really culminate to a huge difference. In fact, all of the testing differences that were there were pretty much within the margin of error. It's 1 or 2 frames here or there, nothing that's crazy or enough to say that yes, you should definitely go with the OLED model over the LCD model. But with all of the culmination and everything that's there with the OLED model in contrast to the LCD, I would always recommend the OLED model over the LCD. It's just, you get so much more, and there were so many minute improvements to the OLED in comparison to the original that you might as well just go for it if you're trying to decide between one or the other. The performance on the ROG Ally, on the other hand, is a step above the Steam Deck. When I was playing, for example, Baldur's Gate 3 on the Steam Deck, I was getting anywhere between, I don't know, 29 to 34 frames on average, but it dipped all the way down to 19 frames per second when I got to Act 3, which is a notoriously difficult area to render on any piece of hardware. But when I was on the ROG Ally, I was getting anywhere between 36 and 45 frames on average, and when I got to that dense area, it dipped down to 30, 31, sometimes it hit 29. But on average, it's just a better overall experience on the ROG Ally when dealing with AAA titles in comparison to the Steam Deck. Overall, if you're looking at playing titles that either cannot run on Linux or have just beefier specs that are needed, I would recommend the ROG Ally in contrast to the Steam Deck. With the Legion Go from Lenovo, you get more or less similar performance in contrast to the ROG Ally. It really depends on what it is that you're trying to look for. If you want more FPS-centric titles to play on this handheld, then I would definitely recommend the Legion Go, because you are going to get that smooth 60 FPS on average, and you are going to have the compatibility and the functionality to play FPS titles with an actual vertical mouse, mouse on the go if you wanted to. Now, at the end of the day, it really depends on the types of games that you want to go ahead and play on this handheld, but performance is on par because it's that same chipset, albeit it is a bigger, larger screen, but you can always decrease the resolution and so on and so forth. But I digress. At the end of the day, it really just depends on what titles you want to go ahead and play. If you want to play beefy AAA titles, then I would definitely recommend the ROG Ally or possibly even the Legion Go. But if you are okay with playing less beefy titles or just dealing with lower frames, then by all means go with the Steam Deck. You're probably going to have a better overall experience, especially when you're talking about performance amongst all three of these. I'm not going to go too in depth in terms of Steam OS and everything that it's capable of doing, but I do want to go ahead and let you know that the Steam Deck and Steam OS offers the closest to a console-like experience whenever you're playing any sort of games in a handheld PC, especially when you compare it to the Asus ROG Ally as well as the Legion Go, because both of those run Windows OS and it's a completely different experience, especially when you compare it to this. Now, the first thing that you want to go ahead and take into account whenever you're playing on your Steam Deck is that you have to get familiar with this quick access menu, these three buttons that are right over here. If you hold that, what's going to pop up is a shortcut window, and you'll be able to go ahead and see all of the shortcuts that are accessible with any sort of button combinations that are there. Then if you go ahead and push that down, you're going to see all sorts of things that are available here. For example, you have your notifications, friends list, as well as quick settings. So if you wanted to adjust things like airplane mode or whatever it may be, you can. And then under performance, this is honestly the coolest thing that I like about this is that it gives you an estimated or projected battery life for the unit itself. So if you're playing something that's more intensive, you're going to see how much battery life you actually have left in comparison to, you know, playing something that's lighter or whatever it may be. Now, obviously, right now I'm in the main menu of the system, so it's saying 7 hours because I'm not using too much juice in the grand scheme of things. The performance overlay, and I'll go ahead and I'll show you right now. The performance overlay just goes ahead and shows you what the frame rate is overall, and you can toggle and see how deep you want to go in terms of that info. So if you want to go and see FPS as well as CPU, GPU, and RAM, you can do that as well, and you can go even further with like battery data and game scope, and then you can see all of the different cores that are available. So it really just depends on what you want to go ahead and see. I personally like to go ahead and see the frame rate, just go ahead and see what's going on. And I do want to go ahead and let you know that you can actually adjust all of these settings on a per game basis. So if you have a game that's like a 2D title that doesn't require too much horsepower, then you can knock down the frame limit. You can knock down the TDP if you wanted to. For example, you can do a TDP limit and just drop that all the way down to whatever it is that you want. Really just depends. Half rate shading has not gotten any better, but in terms of like allowing tearing or disable frame limit or even manually adjusting the GPU clock, you can do that as well. If you are playing on if you have this connected to a television using a Steam Deck dock, then you can go ahead and adjust the scaling that's here. So if you wanted to use FSR, you can. If you want to use NIS, you can. If you want to use, you know, pixel scaling, then you can go ahead and do that easily as well. It really just depends on what it is that you want to do. Now, soundtracks, that's something that's available for you there. There's help. This is Decky Loader, and I have a video talking about this specifically. I'll go ahead and I'll link that up right up here. But it's really nifty having this. It can dramatically change your experience in terms of gaming on here. And then you have the keyboard that just goes ahead and pops up whenever you want. Now, when you go back into the main menu, you see this little check mark that's right here. That goes ahead and indicates that this is a Steam Deck verified game. That means that it will run on the Steam Deck and you won't have any issues with it. If you have games like this that are untested, that's really where things kind of get a little wonky, because Final Fantasy VII in and of itself is a really old game, but it is considered playable. So if you go into details, it'll go ahead and it'll talk about the different things that make it playable. But when I first booted this up on my Steam Deck, I realized that all of the IO or all of the inputs that are on here are tied to keyboard buttons. So in order to do that and make it playable, I had to go into this little area right over here, which took me into custom button layouts, or the current button layout shows this. And then there's the recommended one, which was, this was set up by default to recommended. And then I went over to community layouts and I saw all of the ones that were here that were made by the community. Now, whenever I play Final Fantasy VII, it feels like how it did on the original PlayStation 1 with the controllers and layouts being the way that it should. This is something that I think is really, really awesome. And it's honestly, this whole community factor is kind of what differentiates the Steam Deck in comparison to everything else. But again, you kind of have to be stuck to one platform, and you kind of have to, you know, be okay with just playing games on Steam. If you go into seeing more of your library, you'll have a list of all of your games that are there, as well as some that are pulled out of that list that are great on the deck. And these are games that just run well, they do the job, and you know, you can play with the controller without having to worry about anything. If you go a little bit further to right, you have installed as well as non-Steam and some of the soundtracks that are there. I do want to go ahead and say that if you actually push that Steam button and go all the way down to power and go down to switch to desktop, it'll switch over to the Linux front end of this system, which is really cool if you want to do more modding or anything like that, or do any changes, kind of like with Decky Loader. Now you will see a lot of things that are here, and the trackpad just works just fine. And there are a bunch of tutorials that are out there. I'm not going to go deep into this because it's essentially turning your Steam Deck into a Linux computer. So if you're familiar with Linux, then you'll be right at home. If you're not familiar, there are plenty of tutorials that are out there that'll talk to you a little about handling all this stuff and like changing different settings or whatever it may be. But this is a really cool option and kind of just opens up the gates in terms of the functionality and what you can do with this handheld. Now, when it comes to the Windows OS experience on the Asus ROG Ally, it's actually quite similar to that of the Legion Go. This is Windows after all. So you are going to get all of the pros as well as all of the cons that you would expect from playing on a handheld like this. So if you want to play games like Destiny or Call of Duty, or any games that require any sort of anti-cheat software or anything that just didn't vibe well with the Linux, this can run on here without any issues at all. Now, when you first boot it up, you are going to go into Armory Crate, which is this application right here. Now, this is straight from Asus, and I've got to give them, you know, props, because this is probably the closest that this is going to get to a console-like experience. When you first boot it up, you are going to have access to your game library that's here. And if you don't have anything from the get-go, you can go ahead and download things from your game platforms, or remember, this is Windows. So you can go ahead and get whatever app it is that you want to go ahead and use, log in, download whatever it is that you want from the website, and it'll download and be usable on here without any issues at all. I also want to go ahead and mention that the update center is over here, and that is constantly, like, I literally updated it before I actually started recording. Let's see if there's anything here, but it's pretty straightforward in terms of how to update not only the BIOS but also the drivers on this handheld. For the most part, everything, it doesn't take too long to update, but because of how constant things are being updated, all right, there's nothing here. Because of how constant things are being updated, it's always nice to go over and check that out. Now, when it comes to the system, you can go ahead and get some device info as well as different things and stats on things. But when you go to settings, you're able to go ahead and configure your control mode. So if you want to use a gamepad mode or desktop mode, depending on the games that you're playing, it might benefit one over the other. Now, I do want to mention that here is your edit command center, and your command center is essentially this right over here. When you push this bottom button right here, it'll go ahead and pop up this window. And from here, you have a lot of quick toggles that you can go ahead and access on things. So right now it's at a 30 watt TDP because I'm connected to the power. And once I disconnect, it drops down to 25 watts. Push that down, it goes to 10 watt silent mode, and then there's a 15 watt performance mode. So the turbo is stuck at 25, but if you plug it in, it'll go ahead and go up to that 30 watt. I do like the fact that there is like an FPS limiter if you wanted to pretty much just limit the FPS that are there. So you have 30, 45, 60, 90, 120, and then off. And then there are some really cool things, like if you wanted to decrease the amount of resolution that is being output or displayed on here, you can do so. So there's 720, 900p, and then 1080. This again is to go ahead and save a little bit of battery life when you're out and about. And then you can decrease the refresh rate to 60 hertz, and then from there it'll go to 120 hertz. Again, this is to save a little bit of battery when you are disconnected from your power source. You want to go ahead and have that on the go. If there's different buttons that you want to go ahead and add on, you can go ahead and do that from by hitting that plus button in the command center edit area. And if you wanted to drag something, all you have to do is kind of hold it and then it kind of just drags around, and from there you can reposition things as you see fit. Overall, the application itself, the Armory Crate app, is pretty solid, and it does a really good job in terms of just showing you everything that you need to know. So you don't really need to venture too far out of this if you want to, but if you're a Windows user or a Power PC user, then you might want to go ahead and download things like Steam, for instance, and then from there you can access everything that's needed. Of course, there is big picture mode if you want to go ahead and use that, which will give you a very Steam OS or Steam Deck like experience, because everything's just going to be labeled up as it should. All your emulation stuff is there if you emulate, as well as, you know, more from the actual library, and it works just like the Steam Deck in that sense. Of course, if you wanted to, you can go ahead and exit out, and from there you can go straight back to your Armory Crate and do everything from there if you want to. The options are there, but overall, like I said before, you get the pros and you get the cons when it comes to using Windows OS on here. And to be honest, Armory Crate started out being pretty janky at best, but it's matured and it's become much better in terms of an overall experience that you would get on the user end. Now, when it comes to the Legion Go, the overall experience for the OS side is pretty similar to the ROG Ally in the sense that it's Windows. Again, pros and cons, everything is, you know, you get the good and the bad when it comes to Windows. But Lenovo, they decided to make this front end application that's very similar to the Asus ROG Ally's Armory Crate. I do prefer the Armory Crate over this, but you know, that's just the way that it is. Now, when you come in, you have your library and you can see all of the launchers that are here, as well as all of the games that I've downloaded and played on here. And then if I go to Game Store, from here, it'll take me to gamesplanet.com, which is nice. You know, I do like the fact that it's there. And also, if you scroll down, you have your games that are here. But again, this takes me back to gamesplanet.com. And as far as I can tell, all of the games that are listed here, they are tied to Steam. So if you're okay going with the third-party site, then by all means, you know, that's cool. I'm okay with it as well, but I know some people are not. Cloud gaming, that'll take you to Xbox's website where they talk about xCloud. And then over here on the settings, you can have access to all of these different settings that are here to go ahead and adjust things. Android games opens up the Microsoft or the Windows Store and gives you the option to download Amazon App Store. So then you can go ahead and access your different Android apps. Now, if I were to go ahead and hit this again and hit menu, then you have all of these different things that are here. So if you wanted to, you can see all the different things that are running. Home will take you back home to this screen. If you go to downloads, it'll take you to the download center. This is for screenshots. So you can see some different screenshots that are there. And then this takes you right back into settings, which you can go ahead and use to adjust all sorts of things that are here. Now, I do want you to know that no matter what it is that you're doing, a lot of the things that you may want to change are actually accessible with this button right over here. If you click that, it'll go ahead and it'll boot up this quick access menu. And the cool thing about that is that they've actually updated a lot of the things since I've done my original review of the Legion Go. But for instance, back in the day, if I wanted to go ahead and change the refresh rate, I would have to have this connected in order to do that. I would have to have the power supply connected, but now I can just push the button, it'll flip over, and now it's 60 hertz. Personally, I never understood why it needed to have a power supply in order to actually swap over from 144 to 60 hertz or vice versa, but here we are. Now, there are some frame monitoring things, which again, you can go simple, which is very easy, and then normal, which takes you to GPU, CPU, as well as battery, and you can see your frames, and then you can see everything right then and there if you wanted to go ahead and see. It's pretty straightforward. I like it. It does the job, but I know some people, they don't really care for this stuff, but it is there. You also have the option to turn on the Radeon Super Resolution if you wanted to use that. Again, this is up to you in terms of like what you want to experience. I do like the fact that the TDP is here and you can adjust things. Now, originally, in order to actually access 30 watts, I had to hit custom in the past. And by the looks of it, that's still the same thing. I still have to go into custom in order to actually hit 30 watts. That's not a big deal per se, but you know, it's something to take into consideration if you want to go ahead and do things. There are actual power profiles that are here, performance profiles that are here. So if you want to have your performance, you have your power saving, custom 1, custom 2, if you wanted to go ahead and adjust that. You can adjust the fan curve if you needed to, and so on and so forth. So there's just a lot of of options that are here if you want to go ahead and take advantage of things. If you want to change the layout of the controller or the controller mapping, you can do so, as well as changing the lighting effects that are here in the analog sticks. There's a little bit of LED or RGB that's there, and then enabling the touchpad. I personally love the fact that there is this touchpad here because it makes things so much easier. If you disconnect the controllers and you want to go ahead and have them turn off or go to sleep in a hibernation after a certain amount of time, you can do so accordingly as well. Now, if you go into Xbox game mode, it'll go ahead and show you all of the different things that are here. It's pretty straightforward, but again, you know, it's something to go ahead and take into consideration if you want to. Now, if we go into system quick settings, this is honestly pretty big. Now I feel like the Legion Go has kind of matured a little bit in terms of the OS and the interaction and all this and that, because when I first started out, it was very janky and I needed to come back here frequently to hit the virtual keyboard in order to type anything on the system itself. Now it pops up whenever it senses that there is actually some form of like space for key input. When you're first booting this up, this is not going to be available, and you are going to need to have some form of like USB keyboard in order to actually type things out and type in your password and log in or whatever it may be to set this up for the first time. Once you log into Windows, you will be able to go ahead and use a Bluetooth keyboard. You can go ahead and connect it accordingly, but first time around, you're going to need a USB keyboard kind of like this one. There are plenty online. They're pretty cheap. They're like 10-20 bucks if needed, but it'll do the job. But I like the fact that from here you have your Windows plus D, Alt F4, you have your task manager, file manager, virtual keyboard. You can do a screenshot, you can mute, Wi-Fi settings, Bluetooth settings, or you can hit escape if you need to, whenever you want, wherever you are in the app, because this will go ahead and pop up wherever. Now there is a productivity mode if you wanted to go ahead and connect to an external monitor, and it does a pretty good job. I'm not gonna go deep into it, but it does a decent enough job. And if you have any questions, there is a help center that is here. In the grand scheme of things, this has matured a lot, like I said before, in comparison to when it first came out, because when it first came out, it was pretty janky to say the least. And even now, with how this runs, with the Joy-Con like I wouldn't say joysticks, but the way that this runs now is actually pretty solid, I think, because with your WASD, like if you're playing a first-person shooter and you're playing with this like this, you will have more precision than someone that has an analog stick. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. That's just how it goes. And I honestly, like, I can't complain. Like, it does the job. And because of that, like, I don't play many first-person shooters anyways, but that's still something that's there, and I can't really complain by any means because of that. Now, I don't really know where I'm going to go ahead and put this in there, but I do want to go ahead and mention that whenever you're actually pushing this joystick, the right joystick up, it is very easy to push this control or this power button off as you're putting this up. And that's one of my biggest gripes when it comes to this. Like, I wish that this wasn't so close to here. Like, I almost kind of wish like the air, like the vent was a little bit to the side, and that this was on this side of the 3.5mm jack. I know that this is a personal thing, but every time that I try to go ahead and, like, you know, move this or do whatever, I always end up accidentally hitting the power button, which sucks. So you might be asking yourself, well, which one is right for me? And it really depends on your unique situation. But if you are new to the PC handheld space, or if you're new to just PC gaming overall, I would recommend going with the Steam Deck, just because the overall experience is just easier to get into. And if you want to adjust things, if you want to tweak things, you have the depth to go into adjusting and tweaking things as you see fit. Obviously, you are going to be going through the Linux side of things, but there are a lot of things that are very easy to learn and pick up as you go. And if you want to find something out, you can just go to Google or YouTube and just search for a tutorial in order to find out how to do it. If you're okay with the PC handheld scape and you want to dive deeper and have a little bit more power to play AAA titles, or if you want to play games that have anti-cheat software or whatever it may be, then I would recommend either the ROG Ally or the Legion Go. Personally, out of the Legion Go or the ROG Ally, I prefer the ROG Ally. I think it just has a little bit more of a compact feel and has more mobility factor to it in comparison to the Legion Go. The Legion Go just feels like something that I wouldn't want to take with me, and it's barely a handheld as it is. Whereas with the ROG Ally, I can feel comfortable taking that with me either on long trips or just taking it out to, I don't know, on my daily commute for my job. I feel much more secure with having the ROG Ally instead of the Legion Go. I just feel like the Legion Go can break for whatever reason it may be. So what do you guys think of the ROG Ally or the Steam Deck LCD / OLED or the Legion Go? Let me know in the comments below. I'd love to hear your thoughts on things. And if you want to hear my thoughts on all of these, I have dedicated video reviews on each of them. I'll have links in the description as well as the pinned comment. And I'll also have like some end screen cards over here. But until next time, guys, I will see you on the next one. Peace.